So welcome again. This is a first of 4-part series from the Florida End-of-Life Doula Association. So this first part that we're going to cover today is our scope of practice as end-of-life doulas. Really important topic. Before we begin that, I want to just take a moment for all of our hosts to introduce themselves. You'll get to know us as the Florida End-of-Life Doula Association, and we've created a board to really grow this work throughout the state of Florida. We're really excited about all of you joining in and about all of the just the interest in what's happening in our state. So I'm going to start with Shanti. If you could introduce yourself.
Okay, I'm Shanti. I think you all know me a little bit. I was trained in 2018 by Anelda, and then I took on grief as my specialty. So really glad to be doing this. And I find that when I work with grief, it kind of comes back around to doula work sometimes. That's me. Thanks. I'm in Gainesville.
Thanks, Shanti. Keeley.
Hi, everybody. I'm Keeley, and I'm based in Ormond Beach. I took the training as a Sacred Passage doula through the Conscious Dying Institute in 2018, and I was really interested in the emotional impact of loss, death, and then went on to become a grief recovery specialist, and that's an area that I've been focusing on. And like Shanti, it comes back around, so it intertwines. Thank you.
Thank you. And Terry.
Hi, I'm Terry Coretta, and I'm in North Palm Beach. And I also was trained by doula giver Suzanne O'Brien in 2018. My company is called Sacred Homecoming, and my specialty, my focus is on vigiling. What I do with my clients is create a sacred space, non-denominational. I work with clients on creating the best possible end-of-life experience through vigiling. Thank you.
Thanks, Terry. Sharon.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sharon. Last name is Collier, and I am a death doula as of 2021. I took the program at the University of Vermont, but prior to that, I spent about 10 years as a hospice volunteer with the University of California, Davis Hospice. I fell in love with the work, and I always hoped for a day when it actually could become a career path. So, I'm happy that we are in these times. I am also a mentor and a death doula coach to other people that are pursuing the interest in becoming a death doula. And I am very excited to be a part of this board, and I am in Jacksonville, and I'm happy to meet you all. And I'm here if you need me. And my business is called The Good Death Experience, because I believe that, like everything else in life, it's about the experience we create, and that's what we typically remember is the experience. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. And William.
Hello, my name is William. I'm a licensed funeral director. During the pandemic, I decided to get trained with the University of Vermont also. I wanted to develop a practice that was more holistic, and so I'm very interested in the space between doula and funeral director, and I'm really inspired by the space in between these two places.
Beautiful. Thanks, William. And lastly, I'm Lynn Principe. I'm in Dunedin, Florida. I'm also an end-of-life doula, a conscious dying educator, and a life cycle celebrant. So I'm a funeral celebrant, also a doula mentor. So let's begin. So it's really important to us at Fielded to bring our doula work further into the professional realm, serving folks at the end of their lives. And in order for us to be considered professional, I think it's important for everyone to understand what's the scope of practice for doulas and how we do it safely, not only protecting ourselves, but also our clients. So this is a time when people are very vulnerable and grief-stricken. So it's important that we know our roles and boundaries. And I said, just as I said, not just for their protection, but ours as well. And so we're going to begin with what doulas do. We'll highlight the ways in which doulas can be a bridge between clients and families in the medical institutions and lawyers and so on. We'll discuss the things to be aware of and situations to avoid and how. And then we're going to talk about what's outside of our domain altogether. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Hopefully the gremlins are not going to be with us today. So bear with me. I'm going to present. Okay. So I want to get a thumbs up if this is visible. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. So this is what we're going to talk about today, the scope of practice, what is legal and what is ethical. So sometimes there's black and white, and then there's a little bit of gray. So we're going to hopefully dive into all of that. So like I said, we're going to begin with what we do. So we provide emotional support, right? So that may mean relationship completion, mindful listening. Perhaps we support in forgiveness practices. So helping not only our client, but the family members in this emotional journey that's so intense and can be very intense at the end of life. We provide practical support, and this is a huge one, I think. So this could be under the umbrella of, the umbrella of completion of advanced directives and other necessary documents, education. We want to encourage participation from our family members. So we help to demystify what's happening. We'll inform people of options. We'll coordinate care, visitors. So maybe somewhat of a gatekeeper there. We facilitate communication. We advocate. So it's really important piece of getting everyone on the same page, right? So once we know what someone's wishes are, we want to make sure everyone knows what those are so that they can be honored. In this next bit, I'm going to ask Sharon to talk a little bit about care coordination with other providers. This is something that she's an expert in. You're on mute, Sharon.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
Okay, great. And a lot of my experience with care coordination happened during my time as a hospice volunteer, and my role within the transition from a patient being diagnosed with a terminal illness to the time they actually were, assigned as a case towards, to the hospice. So for me, that was taking in new referrals to hospice, and they were just, pretty much ceasing all healthcare services to be able to, sustain and treat their condition. So for me, what that looked like as a death doula and the things that I found to be quite aware of is just making sure that patients still had access to resources and to make sure that they were still, in the know about the things that they could utilize first, like the hospice care team, making sure that they understood what the social workers were there for, making sure they understood what the chaplains were available for their spiritual needs, making sure that they understood that they had volunteers available to help make sure that they were able to get the resources they needed for the family, and also the respite breaks for the families as well, with the volunteers were there. So now transitioning into a doula role, I still feel that it's important that, the patients that are utilizing hospice services, they do understand that hospice is there for them and the types of services that are available to them, like this. So encouraging your clients. I still have this tendency to say patients, because as a volunteer we call them patients, but of course
Right.
in the death doula role we call them clients. We refer to them as clients. So for the clients, we still recommend that the families and the clients utilize the social work services that they have available to them, as well as the chaplain and services, and make sure that they're aware of them. And then if we have clients that are not utilizing hospice, letting them know that hospice is available to them. So even recommending that as a resource. Also palliative care services, and also like the National Hospice and Palliative Care Organization, you want to be able to refer them to sources like that. Also, we could refer them to the, let's say if it's a cancer, a person that has cancer, I've had to refer them to the American Cancer Society for resources, different nonprofit organizations like Compassion and Choices is a nonprofit that also gives out resources regarding advanced directives and things of that nature that might be outside of our scope or that we do not do, or like the National Institute of Aging, they offer resources on end-of-life care and planning resources. The National Library of Medicine, sometimes families like to look into the particular condition that their loved one has, so they may want to study up on that topic and be able to support their loved one, so they can look at the National Library of Medicine. And then of course, faith-based organizations, to provide other, religious or spiritual supports to the family. And then of course, grief and loss support groups that we can refer them to, and then mental health professionals as well. So that would be one of the other resources that we can also think about, helping them research and giving them little pamphlets or little. Sometimes what I tend to do is now I just kind of like in the Jacksonville area, I look up all these organizations and then I create a one pager or a document. And this is something that you can give to your client and their family in the area of these organizations. So they'll just have it handy and you can hand it to them and they can just look them over, because sometimes they don't have the time to just do the research on their own. So just be, thoughtful to do those type of things ahead of time for your client and their loved ones is a good way to do things that are outside of our scope.
I love that. It's so, the word empowering keeps coming up for me, but giving them the resources that they need, and it helps people to realize that they're not doing this on their own.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And somewhat on this same topic, I wanted to ask Shanti to share her experience more on the side of, you mentioned bringing in other professionals. So sometimes it's hard to know when do we call in those other professionals. And so Shanti has a real life experience story that she would share about that.
Yeah, interesting. I kind of grew up, I had two favorites in the cartoon world. And one was it Dumbo that said, "I'm an elephant faithful 100%. I meant what I said and I said what I meant." And then my other one that really stands out is the Mighty Mouse. So I feel like I've carried Mighty Mouse syndrome into now. So I had a call from I do grief support, grief work. So I had a call from someone who had taken my course, and she had a friend that she wanted to refer. I'll try to be brief. He had been in a motorcycle accident 5 years ago, and he had paralysis from the armpits down. He had a son and an ex-wife, and his son stayed with the ex-wife, and she was his emergency contact for me. We did a video rather than in writing. We did a video recording of his contract with me, which, I think we'll be talking about those at some point, as to what our agreement was. So I was like, sure, bring him on. Somebody who has that kind of grief, like I'm good. I'm ready to rock and roll. I can do this. And so I just accepted him with no payment, completely on scholarship. And soon came to find out that, I learned a lot about his situation, but I also came to find out that when you planned a session, he would not be showing up, which is understandable with his disabilities. And anyway, there were some snowballing concerns about his care falling away, his feeding, his bathing, his support system was falling away. So it turned out that grief wasn't really something we could even deal with, because I was hearing about a lot of critical, to me, critical physical conditions that were of concern. So I called one of our doulas that I thought would be helpful, and I talked with them about it, and they're like, yeah, no, this is outside your scope of practice. I even emailed a few of you in that Tampa area, and everybody, the 3 doulas or whatever that I emailed, like, no, no, like they had the sense to say, no, that's not something I'm going to even touch. So I can't say I regret doing that connection with that person, but I did realize that his condition and his needs were outside of my scope of practice. And I've heard that term, scope of practice, in my training, and I've heard it many times, and I got a real life lesson, and this is not in my scope of practice. So, it was kind of heartbreaking it would have been heartbreaking and hard for me to just say no. But I learned after weeks and weeks of trying to connect, and that it was going to be a no anyway. So I ended up seeing that he had said, my emergency contact is only to be called if it's really an emergency, because it's my ex-wife and and all this. And I was like, okay, we're on emergency alert. So I told him that I was going to contact his emergency contact. And I did. I emailed and I texted. Oh, well, I called first and got no answer. Then I texted, then I emailed. So I would be sure that she got the message that I felt like he was in an emergency situation. And of course, he's down in Bradenton, so he's way far from me. So anyway, just lessons learned, being aware. If we look at our doula list of these things that we do, helping him was outside of that. And I learned, kind of the hard way, but that's my way. My way is the hard way, I guess, in life.
Right.
Yeah. So it's important, though, if I had paused and called a doula when I got the first call, I might have realized and said, not going to be able to do that. So,
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, it's so important. And also we all learn the hard way, don't we? Yeah, thank you, Shanti. And the last bit on this within scope list, and I feel like this is where we shine. Well, I guess we all have our own superpowers, but this is a beautiful part of what we do as doulas, and this is providing comfort care. And that means gentle touch. It means maybe light massage, mouth care, cool cloths, maybe lotion, and depending on what your skills are, what you're trained in, maybe as a doula or before being a doula, you can incorporate those. I know for myself, I always offer Reiki. I once worked with a doula who was an esthetician, and she'd come and paint people's nails while she was sitting with them. So these are these comfort care things that we can provide, and they'll be different for everyone. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about code of conduct. This is maybe not gray area, but maybe keeping us from gray areas. And so I wanted to invite Terry to speak about a couple of these from her experience.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
I have noticed in my work over the last couple of years is that the most important thing that we want to do with our clients is make sure that they understand that they're at the center of all the decisions, that we want to make sure in a time when they feel so powerless that they actually do still have the power to make important decisions. And that is really, really critical. Unfortunately, there have been situations where I would get hired and they would think that I had all the answers. And I had to really set up boundaries with that. I am not a medical person, even though I was trained by Suzanne O'Brien, who happens to be a hospice nurse, oncology. She has all that experience. I'm not a medical person. Ultimately, what is most important, I believe, in our work is that we make sure that our patients maintain their power. And especially during a time when they feel they have none. So whenever I get asked, well, what would you do in this situation? I would say, I'm not you. I don't know what I would do. And I would put the ball back in their court. I would give them statements like, would you like some more information about that? Tying into what we were discussing about the resources, this is where that becomes so critical. Let's look at our resources, who we can turn to. Let's come up with a list of questions. So I'm facilitating them taking their power back. Other things I may ask them, maybe you want to consider XYZ. I don't tell them, but I ask them, maybe you want to consider XYZ. Would you, what do you think is best for you at this time? And a lot of times it's just that centering and getting them grounded so that they can start making those decisions for themselves. And I've had situations where family members were chirping and it's like they have all the answers. And then I have to respectfully bring it back to the patient, because this is their end of life experience. So again, it's all in that creating that bubble of protection around the client, the patient, and letting them know that I've got you. I've got you. Yes, I'm going to be dealing with your family, especially after the death. I will be there to hold them as well. But for now, you are my focus. And so just being able to have those conversations before things get a little dicey is really important. Setting up those boundaries with your client. And some of these things here, the code of conduct, be respectful of your client's preference for touch. Ask all these questions before we get into, especially as a visualist, these are really, really critical things to understand, because when they get into that transition phase and they're not able to talk, you want to make sure that you are conducting yourself exactly the way the patient wanted you to be in that moment. Respecting family dynamics while maintaining a calming environment. Yeah, that is very, very critical. I don't want to take up too much time. I have a story where in a vigil situation, I had to ask family members who were loud, obnoxious. I had to remind them that this is a very sacred moment and that this is a sacred area and that we need to move that out into the hallway. So that's where we act as advocates, and ultimately those people really respect us for doing that and acting as professionals. And the family members then, oh, I'm so glad you did that because I didn't have the guts to say anything. So we're able to step in on that. So I think that's most important. Don't impose your values or your beliefs. I walk in as a blank slate. I am just an energetic vessel to hold sacred space for my patient or my client. Thank you.
Wonderful. Yeah, but you said so many great things. Thank you so much, Terry. I wanted to add a thought about the client's touch. A lot of times as a hospice volunteer, I'd go into a room not having met the person before, right? And so I was going to sit bedside and I try to remember, say, introduce myself and I'm going to hold your hand. And even if they're not speaking, there are little cues that you can watch for, right? You can tell if they're kind of slowly start creeping away or creeping forward, just really paying attention to body language. Something else I wanted to, and I think you alluded to this, Terry, is so whenever possible, empowering others to, and then you take a secondary role, right? So we can sometimes be in the forefront when it's needed, but when we're not, we can step back, right? And it's holding that bubble. I like to think of it as like placing a bubble around, especially in a vigil atmosphere. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. All right, let's move on to, all right, so how do we maintain our own boundaries and keeping ourselves safe as well as our clients? So we're going to talk about risk management. We're going to respect client confidentiality. So this is a big one. You know, it's really important, as Shanti said, you've got to be able to call your colleagues and talk about what's going on. We're a great resource for one another. So it's really important not to give information that is not necessary, such as names. Some people may be okay with you taking pictures, but you want to get written okay for that, especially if you want to use them later for any presentation or something like that. Make sure you have a written agreement to use photographs. And then social media, you know, what you're putting out on social media. It's really important to respect the confidentiality of your clients. And then in cases such as V said, I think it's really important to have extra backup when it comes to, I like to get like a video confirmation from the person explaining that this is what they want. And in case there's anything, you know, later on where people might, and like I said, people are grieving and that may show up in different ways. And I think it's important in those situations for everyone to be able to see from that person's face and in their own words that this is what they wanted. And so there's no call for neglect at that time. So as doulas, we don't provide assisted suicide. We don't administer medication. This is a big one. Like Terry said, we don't give medical advice. We don't transfer a client. So we don't take someone from their bed and put them in their wheelchair and bring them in the bathroom and put them back in their wheelchair and back in the bed. That's outside of our scope. It's best if we obtain liability insurance. And what that does, it may not stop someone from suing you if they want to do that, but it will provide protection for your assets. They'll settle your claims. They'll give you HIPAA defense. But only if you're working within the scope of practice for your state. If you're outside of your scope, you won't have that protection. And again, for malpractice and negligence, they'll protect you there as well. It's important, and we're going to go into this in one of our other calls. So having really good contracts is probably the first place, right, for risk management, so that people understand what you will and will not provide, how you're meant to be paid, refunds, maybe a retainer. You'll have something in there about using backup doulas if you're not available or in case of emergency, and when does service end. So these are some things that would be in your contract. And let's see, where are we? So this has come up a little bit lately with doulas being asked to sign on as legal legal power of attorney for healthcare. So there's definitely some protocols you want to follow if that is the case. Make sure that it's all done legally and that you've exhausted all their options. You know, if they don't have any other family members, that's one thing, but you want to just keep those waters as least muddy as possible. We do not provide after-death body care. I know this was not the case when I was trained as a doula, and probably true for some of you here. And Will's going to go into a lot more of that. And we do not transport after death. So when it comes to the after-death conversation, I'm going to invite William to go into that. He is our resident funeral director. We are so grateful to have your expertise. So I'm going to just switch my slides for you, William.
Perfect. I want to point out that there's some questions in the chat. I'm going to give a large amount of text and I'm going to download you some resources, but I want to make sure we circle back to those so that they don't disappear behind what I'm just downloading for you all. I'm so interested in the space between doula and funeral director because that is my professional practice. And so as we're all getting education, we're coming to these organizations that are giving us broad educations that are beyond state. And so here we are as an association here in Florida, and we have the opportunity to really look at the laws that are particular to our state and what govern us and what govern our best practices. And there's some places where there's gray area between these a little bit. And I don't want to do anything that discredits anything Lynn just talked about, but we specifically started having a conversation the other night because I think doulas can be so many different kinds of things.
Mhm.
And if a doula steps in a kind of spiritual capacity, I, as a funeral director, think that there's space for aftercare that is specifically through a spiritual context, and the law protects those kinds of things.
Mhm.
And so I'm going to quickly move through some kind of like the most important things. This is the book of laws that I had to study, which is over 600 pages, I think, to pass my law exam for the state of Florida. And I think there are some really important things in here, and a lot of things I don't think it really applies to us. So I want to draw some attention to that. If you happen to be in a space of sitting vigil and you are present at the time of passing, I want to pull your attention to a few things, specifically in the 69K part of the law book, that specifically, we have a time frame that once time of death has occurred, we have 24 hours until a decision has to be made about embalming or refrigeration. Now, is there a precise moment where you compare like a doctor pronouncing or a hospice nurse pronouncing, and then you're there in that actual moment? It isn't so precise in that kind of way. But roughly speaking, we have a duty to make sure that if you're in this space, that something is happening, a decision is going to be made by the next of kin. And so I wanted to draw your attention. And so I have put in the chat a lookup for laws that you can begin to peruse. I will say it's really complicated and hard to read, and I've had to speak with lawyers, to reach out to other funeral directors to sort of understand what they're saying in some of the laws. Some sections of the book are fluid and quite straightforward when they're talking about death registrations in terms of your death certificate, but other areas get really complicated. And so I wanted to draw everyone's attention to that particular moment, which is 24 hours of death is a really pivotal time period that goes by. And as a doula, you begin to have some exposure, that's what I like to call it. Some exposure if you are somehow a part of a situation that doesn't lead to an answer. Like there is, at most, I think doulas are in danger of misdemeanors, and there's tier 1, 2, and 3. And I don't think there's many things that we do that go beyond a misdemeanor. So I think it's really helpful to start like laying this out and like looking at it more closely. Human remains are sometimes transported by people in my universe. And I know Lynn in her previous slide talked about that we don't do that. But I want to draw attention to an organization here in Gainesville that I'm familiar with, which is called the Final Friends. And they're a kind of renegade organization, and they've made me very aware that things aren't so black and white, specifically when money isn't being exchanged for services. Now, as doulas, the large majority of us are making a financial transaction. And so the department, and we can go to the next slide, the department that regulates funeral directors, they're in earsight of us. They're in the peripheral. And Lynn shared with me a lawsuit that is happening in California. Basically, a funeral home or some organization of people started to say some doulas were essentially operating as a funeral establishment. In this accusation, I think we have kind of like opened up the conversation of where there are hard stop boundaries between the things doulas do and do not do. And so I've outlined some of the misdemeanors that I think are most relevant to us. In the photograph, there's a picture of Techie Ice, which Shanti has, and if anyone needs some, get a hold of her, and she's got quite a few of these. I'm looking at purchasing something out of Europe, which is a much more sophisticated version of this. But again, the statutory minimum of refrigeration is a really important threshold of legal exposure. And that is a misdemeanor if you were somehow involved in a situation working with a client family where a death has occurred and we have waited more than 24 hours. As a funeral director, when I take a first call, I like to let families know that if they want to take a moment, an hour or two, it's okay. And I give them that permission. If I sense in their phone call, as me acting as a funeral director, they're feeling rushed by that. I think it's so important for doulas to kind of set expectations and validate families who maybe don't want to move at a pace that feels faster than they're ready to move at. And so I think that's a really amazing permission to give to people. But again, that specific time period is important and we need to pay attention to that. If we were to somehow to be witness to a death and were to just leave and for that death to go unknown, there could be exposure there. And again, that is a misdemeanor also. And the numbers next to it are the specific statutes. So if you want to look up any specific one, you can jot that down and then begin to connect it to the specific law. And while it's hard reading these laws, it's a place to start and it's an important place to get familiar with. I've highlighted several other places. 497-159 talks about an unlicensed person performing and engaging activities that require licensure. This law is really designed to speak about funeral homes and funeral establishments, but it's intentionally vague. And this is the place where a lot of funeral directors or larger lobbying industries push back on direct disposers, and also push back on doulas in some way. I don't think at the moment doulas are particularly on a lot of people's radar in terms of like this kind of conversation about legislation by the 497 Division Committee, but the California example, which is in the chat, is an example where here is a place where friction is being reached. Like there is fear that you're infringing on territory. And I think we know what this feels like in a hospice situation. And I think we have to sort of turn as we pivot to other sectors and other partners to understand where the boundaries are. When we go and talk as an association, we frequently talk about aftercare not being on the menu. But I will say that's a little bit of a gray area in my opinion, because I do think some doulas are an extension of spiritual care. And then when that happens, I think the doula that is a celebrant, that is a different conversation. And in educating us through all the different programs, they've had to be careful and they've had to emphasize broad rules because some states are much more firm about these boundaries than other states. In Florida, I have seen people get death certificates without a funeral director. That is not easy, and that really is a doula as a community advocate. That doula knows the medical examiner. And you can go to the next slide. That doula knows the hospitals. That doula is friendly and on good terms with the registrar. That doula knows all the gatekeepers in their community. And that is a really specific kind of doula. And I think Shanti Vani, I know that you're that kind of doula sometimes, and I've seen other people kind of fall in and out. And it's interesting, you have to get to know your community and what's possible. I happen to live in Gainesville, which is definitely a more hippie area who wants to press the limits of things. And in other communities, you might not have a sheriff or a medical examiner that's open to this. And so that's the place in which there is gray area, because just because they're a law doesn't mean it's enforced. And in a specific example of that, there is a law that you have to have a burial transit permit when you're transporting a body. But I, as a funeral director, frequently break this law. And so in some ways, doulas or people who are operating outside of the system are held to a higher standard than I sometimes am as a funeral director. And there isn't a reason I'm like, we aren't just breaking this law for no reason. It's just impractical in terms of the way that we now have moved digitally. In the past, this was a paper document and it was a really easy thing to generate. But at this moment in time, we now have an electronic death registry system. And until I enter people's vital statistics into it, I don't have a burial transit permit. And so the law hasn't exactly kept pace with the way in which business is being done. And so it's important for you to understand also, just because there's a law doesn't mean anyone's enforcing this law. but also you will be held to a higher standard than probably anybody else. And so it's unfair, but we have to be really careful because we do not want to initiate legal actions. Those are expensive and ultimately really drain on our resources as doulas. And so I would like to make an advocate for that the boundaries are a contested field within what's legal, but we want to avoid disciplinary actions and we want to stay far away from them as possible. And so we want to align ourselves with partnerships. We want to align ourselves with funeral directors. We want to align ourselves with resources that we can lean into if we get close to a moment that is out of our scope. I've included a few text threads of kind of conversations I've had recently. I reached out to a friend who teaches mortuary education at 5 different colleges, and she said, well, what you're saying might be true in Florida, but in some states that I have worked in, specifically Connecticut, Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Louisiana, Michigan, Nebraska, New Jersey, and New York, there's much firmer boundaries in terms of you must engage a funeral director in doing things. And so we live in a state where there is room, and I found some cheesy lawyer who is advertising this, basically saying you don't need a funeral director. You can legally go around them and bypass them. And I just found this in a casual Google search. I have a screenshot from Final Friends who I talked about, and it's very interesting to have these case studies and look and see how people interpret the laws and what for them stands out as the most important things. Final Friends on their website talks about the 24-hour rule, which for me is like the big one. And that's the one I feel like we all can work towards that, because having that technique sheet is a low barrier of entry for us to meet a statutory minimum moment. But Final Friends goes beyond the space of a doula because they are a kind of DIY something, I don't even know what to call them exactly, but they are trying to help families transport. And so that's pushing beyond the scope of what doulas traditionally will touch. And so they're very concerned that the body is covered, there's modesty, and on top of that, there is a barrier for liquids, because that's about contagious diseases. And a lot of rules that we have in the industry for funeral directors are about public safety. So I think there are rules that are about sort of gatekeeping what isn't profitable and how people can make money off of providing services. And then the other big thing is about public safety. A lot of these things are directly tied to that. They talk about that the body might not be cremated for 48 hours. That's a great piece of information to know when you're doing education for your families if cremation is happening. It's helpful to let them know to help manage their expectations that in Florida, and now in Georgia, it's completely different. They're very quick to cremate, and it's a completely different state. And up here in North Florida, I commonly press against these state differences because there are beliefs and expectations that are different, and they're shaped by the guidelines of where their person is at. And lastly, they talk about the burial transit permit again. So here are places where the law really informs what we can and can't do. I really encourage you to get more comfortable with dealing with these. Sometimes we can just give this book all this power and not be able to claim our own agency in that. And so I have dropped information how to order this. So any doula who would like to have their own copy, it's $10, very affordable. You can order it from the state, and I've just given you directions inside of there. I also encourage you to attend as a public person attending a 497 division meeting. They're monthly. I've given a website address that talks about the division meeting. You can see a funeral home that did something wrong and is getting dinged. And you can see what that looks like. And I think you can internalize for yourself the appropriate places to have hard stops between your practice and what's outside of your scope of work when you observe in real time what's happening in our communities around Florida. And I think that's incredibly useful to sort of step into that space. I'll do one more slide.
Okay,
This will be my last slide.
so much good information.
So gatekeepers. So we are going to experience all different kinds of gatekeepers, and I encourage you to be proactive, to go and meet people, to get to know people. I hope that our association will further like these kinds of relationships, and that we will go and eventually meet with all the different districts. Florida is broken up into a variety of districts, and so different counties fall inside of those districts, and then your medical examiner works from there. And it's really important to have a good relationship with your medical examiner. It can really diffuse situations when your medical examiner knows who and what you are, knows what your organization is, and knows that they can trust you, that you know the laws, that you are a community partner for them and a resource for them. And that really can change the way in which you're able to broker these relationships to help your families. Knowing your medical examiner is really helpful in situations where trauma occurs, where there's concern for elder abuse. Medical examiners are the interface between the justice system and the kind of death care system. Like, it's a place to find out if something criminal has happened, if some kind of liability has happened by a hospital. There's a variety of reasons in which the medical examiner is brought into the conversation, so it's important to be in contact with them. I think sheriffs are really important community partner to be in partnership with. We have certainly had some encounters here in Alachua County with the Sheriff's Department that could have gone better. And I think sometimes in situations when sheriffs are involved, it's some of the hardest cases, because maybe a death has happened and everyone's surprised by this death. Maybe a criminal activity has happened. Usually when the sheriff's involved, there are big unknowns, and it can be a place of really escalated fear, friction, tension, and this can be a place where a doula can be an advocate and can be a community liaison to help with this situation. It's important for people to know their rights. Sometimes there is a need to get a decedent into the care of a funeral home immediately and quickly, and that sometimes can be faster than the family is ready for that to happen. And so you can be an important resource for your client's family in this moment. Getting to know your county registrar is an incredibly important thing, because they hold the key to death certificates, to getting more death certificates, to understanding who can have a long form versus a short form. A long form DC has some sensitive information on it, specifically cause of death and Social Security, versus a short form, which is essentially public record. Anything on that form is now public record, and that sometimes families are surprised by. Also, local cemetery staff. It can be good to just know all the people who touch your ecosystem, depending upon what happens in your community. Because we have such a strong presence of natural burial, doulas might or might know Prairie Creek Conservation Cemetery staff, and that might not be a strange thing for a doula to kind of be a resource for a family, and to sort of be a resource to help the family manage their expectations for how that'll go. And so we might have more contact than other communities with a cemetery. Again, the Florida Department of Financial Services is our regulatory body. I have dropped information about division meetings that are monthly. They're long and tedious, but I encourage you to attend one or two just to see how and why people are getting into trouble. What things have they done that have broken the rules? And it'll give you a much clearer sense of what matters. Lastly, order your own copy of the statutes. I've dropped that into the chat, and I highly recommend you order this book. It's not a page turner. I read it when I had COVID last year. But it's really important because it sets the boundaries for everybody, and we are in the periphery. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to stop share now so we can see one another. Wow, that was amazing, Will. A couple of things I wanted to mention. So it seems like, you know, we're talking about these gray areas, and you could even call some of them contradictions, right? And I think that what's important here is that we're giving you all the information that you need so that you can decide where that works for you, or just understand what's expected. I think when it comes to after death body care, I know for myself, I may, you know, help to put a dress over someone's head, but what I'm really doing is I'm guiding the family to do that. and that feels completely in alignment for me. So these are these little gray areas that, you know, there's not going to be, you know, the funeral director, police there watching you, right? So
Exactly.
it's just really important to understand where those boundaries are, though. You know, on my website, I say that I guide in, you know, after death body care. So that's important language, I think.
So just real
yeah.
quick, Laura was asking on the chat, are we legally allowed to help wash a body, or are we supposed to just direct the family? Or, I mean, who's going to arrest us?
Yeah.
But, you know, so.
Yeah, I think that we are there to direct. Would you agree with that, Will?
I would, and I think here's the difference that I see. There is like sanitizing and doing public health bathing, and that is about orifices, that is sometimes about packing orifices, that is about purge. And then there's like ceremonial bathing that is essential oils and water. And I think those are different things. And I think if it's an extension of spiritual practices, this is a different conversation.
I think that's really important. Thank you.
That helps.
Yeah, we only have a couple of minutes left. I'm afraid to open the chat because we're going to run out of time. So as far as follow-ups go, I feel like this deserves more conversation, and we could maybe email some more conversation about that, just to keep in touch, because because it is not black and white. This is going to be a conversation, and I don't know if anyone else is interested, but I say we do a call on home funerals very soon, and have Will lead the way for that. Our next our next month's call is going to be all about your website and directories and how to get yourself out there in all those ways, and we'll talk about that stuff in our next call. If anyone has any quick things they want to add, and we have 3 minutes. So I know Liz wanted to say something. Did you want to add anything? Yes.
Hi, thank you very much, all the presenters. The information was fantastic. I just wanted to add one recommended extra step under risk management.
Yes.
And that is, it would behoove us in our assessment process to do kind of like a 2-step check for, are there designated decision makers, like explicitly asking and documenting, do you have a healthcare surrogate, that kind of thing. But an extra step that I plan to do is to go to my local probate division online and see if there's a court-appointed guardian. Because sometimes people forget or don't want to acknowledge that there's a court-appointed guardian. And depending on the scope of their guardianship, whether it's plenary or limited, that can really influence our work of whether or not we can proceed. So I encourage everyone to become familiar with just the website of your probate division, which oversees guardianship in Florida.
Thanks for that. Okay. Do you want to stop the recording, Shanti?